We're not even through the first month of 2024 yet, and the number of Switch 2 rumors that have been going around for this year is ridiculous. People really want to know what Nintendo is up to. There have been so many rumors over the years as far as what additional hardware Nintendo could be working on, and a lot of past rumors, potential leaks and the like have all pointed towards this being the year that new hardware could happen. And because of that, either because there actually is something coming on the way very soon, or because there is that awareness of something could be announced this year, there is a lot of debate and talk just flying around of what this system could be. So I want to go over all the big rumors that have really just been cropping up the past couple weeks. I also want to point to a couple older ones that I just find interesting to talk about a little bit more, as well as my own speculation of what could be going on with Nintendo's hardware. And hopefully, by the time this video is edited and live, there won't be 7 new ones that I have to try and figure out how to incorporate. To begin with, the first thing I want to talk about actually isn't a leak or rumor in the traditional sense, but rather an educated guess from a very established analyst. At the start of the year, Serkan Toto did an article with Game Industry going over just a couple of different things and trends for the year. Switch 2 is one of the things talked about. And in general, he's one of the analysts that I've personally really liked keeping up with. There's just a lot of takes and ideas that he has that I think make a lot of sense, even though, again, at the end of the day, these are more or less educated guesses. And in his mind, for Nintendo's next hardware, there's really 2 main points worth talking about. 1, the form it takes, and 2, price point. For the form it takes, he is of the opinion they are going to do a direct Switch upgrade in some way. Now, I personally have been very vocal about the fact that while I think that makes a lot of sense, I've also been that of the opinion when it comes to Nintendo to always expect the unexpected. Oftentimes, when you think they're going to go one way, they'll go an entirely other. But considering the ongoing success of the Switch, while there is always the possibility for some kind of additional added gimmick on top of it, it does make a great degree of sense for them to do just an effective direct upgrade. Which I will say too, when you look at the history of Nintendo consoles, they tend to do things in pairs like that. Nintendo to Super Nintendo, Wii to Wii U, especially in the handheld sector, Game Boy to Game Boy Advance, DS to 3DS, throw the DSi in the middle there. So a direct Switch successor does make sense. The other thing you mentioned was pricing and timeline, saying that he thinks it would be something that would come out in the later half of the year, which I think is a fairly popular take at the moment. There have been previous leaks and rumors that have pointed towards September being that particular month. We're going to talk about that in a second as well. But then for pricing, one of the things that he brings up, and this lines up with a couple other rumors I'm going to talk about, thinking that the system was going to cost around $400. There's a couple reasons why this would be the case. First off, when you look at the current model Switch, obviously, Nintendo has maintained that value its entire life cycle. It launched at $300. It is still $300, although there was one minor model bump that happened in the middle of it. Even with a new model like the OLED coming out, they just introduced at a higher price point at $350. So having new hardware come out that is more powerful in that system, and also at a time when yen is not as valuable as it was back when the Switch came out, there's a lot of reasons that it makes sense for Nintendo to introduce this new hardware at a higher established price point. And $400 to me makes a lot of sense. I don't see Nintendo trying to hit the same price point as other traditional home consoles, like with the Series X and PS5 at $500. And while, going below $400 would certainly be more aggressive, it is still at that lower number, which I think is important. Now, I think what is one of the most interesting supposed leaks that has come out this year comes from a Taiwanese forum talking about some specific Switch 2 specs. Again, there is nothing that really verifies how actually true any of this information is, although a lot of it does agree with some past popular rumors and theories, which is kind of how sometimes people get on this track of thinking, oh yeah, this sounds exactly right. But in terms of what this one is claiming, it's specifically talking about, again, a price point of $400 for the system. But the other kind of shorter spec things I want to focus on right now are claims of greatly improved battery life, internal storage in the form of a 64GB SSD, and a 120Hz refresh display. All 3 of these make sense to a certain extent. Battery life is a little debatable because obviously we don't know how powerful this machine is, although our guess is based again on that processor. Being a more powerful machine means that it would be more power hungry, but maybe they've also found better ways to make it more efficient. How large the internal battery is, there's ways that can happen. The internal storage being 64GB, as extremely small as that sounds and not really fitting for a lot of hardware coming out in 2024, coming from Nintendo does make a certain amount of sense, especially if the focus of the main version of the system is to still support physical carts. One of the benefits of Nintendo carts versus the discs that we use for PS5 and Xbox is the fact that you can rely on reading directly from carts rather than having to store anything internally. You're still going to put your save data there, you're still going to put any digital games you get there, so 64 gigs is going to fill up very quickly if you're not focused entirely on just having every game you own physically. But with that knowledge in mind and just knowing Nintendo's past history when it comes to storage, it's not that surprising. The only thing that gives me a little bit of a hang up on whether or not that could be accurate has to do with other past rumors we've heard in regards to Nintendo potentially having 2 launch models for the system, one physical support, the other one being a digital only, like we've seen with the PS5 digital and the Series S. Which, if that were the case, Nintendo launching 64 gig internal for that is a lot more confusing. It's basically an admission that you absolutely have to buy a micro SD card because a digital focus system with only 64 gigs with how large games have been getting, yeah, that's not gonna cut it. And then of these specs, the one that I'm personally a little bit more skeptical about is a 120 Hz display. Now I can see a couple different arguments for why 120 Hz makes sense, especially if the system's going to be backwards compatible with previous Switch games. Any titles that can run 60 FPS on the old Switch with the benefit of added increased power on a new model could hit 120 and then benefit from a 120 Hz refresh display. Future Nintendo titles could also potentially favor high refresh rate over visual fidelity, but honestly, that's just not a thing that has ever occurred to me as something Nintendo actually cares about. Certainly Nintendo has released games that are stable 30 or even stable 60 depending on the particular title, but hitting high refresh rates, at least for Nintendo first party, not a thing I've ever really thought of Nintendo actually actively thinking or caring about. Now, one counterpoint to this that was brought up to me by Travis of TLD, because we all work together, is that in his mind, it could be something where that's not necessarily Nintendo's intention, but whoever they're sourcing the panels from might have an interest in trying to sell them that particular kind of display. I still don't see it as something as a direct priority for Nintendo, but with the surrounding circumstances, sure, a 120 Hz display on a new Switch system is a possibility. Now, as for the T239 processor, this is something that's actually been going around for a little while now. That is a customized version of a previous NVIDIA processor called the T234. Now, to be honest, I don't consider myself the absolute best when it comes to talking about some of the more nitty-gritty technical aspects of things like processors, but I think one of the best ways to really learn more about this particular rumor is to look at an article that Digital Foundry made back in October. They really looked at a lot of past rumors and things from NVIDIA's side that would point to the existence of this T239 and why it makes sense that it is something that could work for a new Nintendo hardware. They themselves do also still emphasize the fact that none of this is 100% verified, but there's a lot of evidence for why this would make sense, and they even go so far as to try and mock up something of similar power level to show what a system like that would be capable of. This leads into another thing that's been circulating a lot the past couple weeks, the claim that the Switch is as powerful as a PS4. Now, this is actually based on some older leaks and rumors, but it's been making a lot of additional rounds lately because it's such a simple sentence for people to meme about, talking about how, you know, oh man, Nintendo's gonna release a new system in 2024 that's as powerful as something that came out 10 years ago. And where there's actually some degree of light evidence for this comes from the Microsoft Activision cases that were going on forever over the past couple years. But one of the things that surfaced from that and from documents as a part of it was claims from Bobby Kotick about how they were in talks with Nintendo, they knew about what hardware they were working on coming out with, and in his words, though I'm still paraphrasing a bit here, their next hardware would be as powerful as last-gen systems, specifically the PS4. Relating this back to that Digital Foundry article where they were doing tests with the supposed configuration of something power-wise similar to the T239, it looks like that performance spec level at least would be something that is, yes, comparable to a PS4, but actually a bit more powerful. On top of that, just working with modern day technologies and options, you can't necessarily do a one-to-one comparison that way because there are a lot of ways of leveraging that power differently now that can result in better performance. Obviously, one of the big talking points that came up in the past for Switch rumors, especially when everyone was talking about Switch Pro, is the idea of leveraging NVIDIA DLSS as a way of doing lower internal resolutions that are then turned into higher display resolutions that still look really good and maintain performance. There's ways of having better optimization for modern game engines. The idea of just simply saying that it's equivalent to a PS4 isn't really painting the full picture, and is one of the situations where you just look at a spec sheet and it doesn't necessarily line up with the actual experience of seeing the thing actually running and working. So the idea of something that is maybe roughly equivalent to a PS4 but a little more powerful obviously is going to have great looking games in handheld mode if they're still targeting 720p for there, and then is able to take advantage of better modern optimization along with techniques like DLSS to achieve things like higher resolutions in docked gameplay, potentially even hitting something like 4K. It's just not going to be native 4K. A couple of things from this month I want to touch on. There's been a fixation on Nintendo delisting a lot of physical copies of certain first-party games. Delisting in the sense of they just haven't been giving new shipments to any major retailers. You're not seeing new copies pop up at places like GameStop or Best Buy or Target. And this is leading a lot of people to speculate that could be tied into Nintendo dropping new hardware later this year. Maybe they're rebranding the boxes, maybe they're re-releasing the games in some way. In my mind, what makes the most sense here is Nintendo revisiting the Nintendo Select concept where, they're going to re-release a bunch of these games at a lower MSRP with boxes that don't look like the original branding and emphasize that these are, Nintendo Select games. They're big hit first-party titles that you should add to your collection, and then a lot of people are either going to buy those on sale or begin paying more money to buy original box versions of the games because they don't like the way that new version looks. Which certainly could be tied into a new system coming out, especially if the next version of the system is backwards compatible. There's a lot of logic for making these games once again more heavily available because anyone who's buying a new version of the Switch that didn't invest in the original for some reason now has an excuse to buy up a bunch of these games that are now at a lower MSRP. Or even if someone is upgrading, it's just a more reason to push, hey, here's all these older titles you may not have bought the first time around, you should grab them now. This is one of those things that is definitely a little bit of a reach, but it does make a certain sense when you look at how many first-party titles are not actively being resupplied at this moment and which ones they are, because it is, at least for the most part, some of the older Switch games that have released and not things that have been from the past year. Another big talking point going around, assuming the next system is in fact a direct Switch successor, what is Nintendo going to call it? Now, for short, a lot of people lately have just been calling it the Switch 2, which I don't think many people think is the actual real name Nintendo's going to go for. It's just been a very simple shorthand to reference, the next Switch system. And so there's been a lot of theories and ideas going around of what people would call the next Switch. One of the most popular ones being the idea of calling it the Super Switch or the Super Nintendo Switch. This is a name and idea that dates back all the way to Switch Pro rumors. And one of the main reasons why people want to see that happen is because it's a really cool callback to Nintendo's initial golden era with the NES going into the Super Nintendo, right? You had the Nintendo Entertainment System, now here's the Super Nintendo. Well, the Switch is this new golden era for them, so now the next system is the Super Switch. Personally, while I think that'd be a nice touch, I don't think that's what Nintendo's going to do. However, I do think absolutely that it is something along those lines they would go for. I mean, when you look at the past of when they've had systems that go from direct successors to each other, there's always some kind of name pick that has to do either with a gimmick of the system or talking about it just being more powerful, right? Nintendo to Super Nintendo, more powerful. Game Boy to Game Boy Advance, more powerful. DS to 3DS, it's a fun name play on adding the 3D element to the screens. Wii to Wii U, they thought it was a fun way to play with, it was Wii, now it's with you as well, and it was a whole thing. It didn't work, it confused a lot of people. With that in mind, Super Switch certainly makes sense. I could see them going in some other direction as well, where they do something like Switch Up, Switch Next. We could always have another callback to when they did the 3DS and new 3DS, where they do the new Nintendo Switch, which I really hope actually isn't the route they actually go. I'm just spitballing different names here. One dumb idea I've had, I also don't think this is a realistic one, but if they were gonna call it something like Switch 2, I just know they wouldn't be able to resist the compulsion to call it a simple number 2 and would have to do something like Switch TOO. A couple of things I want to shout out real quick from some old rumors. There were claims of Nintendo possibly doing a digital-only version of the system. In that particular supposed leak, they were claiming that then that means the system is actually going to be $400 for the digital system and then $450 for a physical one. I'm a little hesitant on this one. It does make sense that a lot of companies are embracing offering digital-only versions of systems to help push people in the direction of going all digital. I mean, the market in general is already favoring people buying digital games over physical, as much as that saddens me. But I don't know if that's necessarily a move Nintendo themselves are going to make right now, especially if the other rumors of the internal storage only being 64 gigs ends up being true. Another bit of a debatable point, I've seen a few people talk about whether or not the next system would be OLED like the latest Switch model, or if it would once again be an LCD screen. Most past rumors and reports are pointing towards them doing an LCD screen again, which I personally agree with. I think something like an OLED screen makes sense down the line, but especially if Nintendo is having more expensive hardware in the system itself, they're also looking to counterbalance the decreased value of the yen. If they're gonna up the price to $400 and they don't wanna up it even more, launching with an LCD screen over OLED makes a lot of sense, and then an OLED model is something that comes out 2-3 years later. Something similar to how the Switch had the Switch OLED happen 4 years in, and even with a more recent example, Valve did the Steam Deck OLED a year after releasing the original version of the Steam Deck. Once again, none of this is really truly verified. There's snippets of reports here and there, leaks where some sound maybe more real than others, or maybe some are potentially out of date. And when taken all together, this is the image that we're currently getting. But it's also entirely possible that some of this is people just talking in circles over and over again, feeding the same rumors to make them sound more believable, and then Nintendo's going to completely come out of left field with something way different than we're expecting. There really is just no way of knowing until they actually say something themselves. So that's just my 2 cents on all the Switch speculation that's been going around lately. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys later.